So there's method to the madness of what the College Board put together for this fifth era. In 5.1, we talked about the Industrial Revolution, all right, and the growth of your Western European industry. Industry requires empire, and that's 5.2, right? Industry requires empire, that you've got to have overseas sources for raw materials to feed the industrial machine, and then you need overseas markets to sell your finished products to. So that's all 5.2. Now we come to 5.3. Nationalism, revolution, and reform. All right? A drive now that we've had this industrialization and we have growing wealth in European powers and we have the creation of empires, that some of these empires will begin to change their political forms, giving more voice to more people. Because guess what happens during the Industrial Revolution? You have more people that are entering the middle class. You have more people that are owning property. You have more people that want a political voice in their states. You have people, and I'm going to use this phrase a couple times today, that desire to be citizens of a state, of a nation, rather than subjects of a king. All right? And then you're also going to have a lot of people who have been taken over, who have been controlled by outside empires, where maybe they don't feel like they are truly an equal part of that empire, and they might want to break free from it. So that's what we're going to be talking about over the next couple days, and we start with the ideals that are going to drive this move for nationalism and ultimately revolution and reform, and that is the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment follows on the heels of the scientific revolution that we've already talked about. If you recall, with the scientific revolution, this was Western European scientists and mathematicians and thinkers who were looking for rational explanations for why the world worked the way it worked. And we get something like the scientific method being developed, right? Like something can only be deemed as true if it can be like replicated again and again. So you've got experiments that test hypotheses. And then ultimately you can come to some kind of scientific truth. The Enlightenment follows on the heels of the scientific revolution in that you're taking the same principles of rational thinking and reason, but not applying them necessarily to the natural world around you, but applying them to the human world around you, the social world around you. So with a nod to the scientific revolution, these are European thinkers who begin to challenge the conventional wisdoms, who begin to challenge the status quo. You guys heard that phrase before? Status quo, it's just the way it's always been done. Begin to challenge the status quo in Western Europe. And they begin to apply rational methodology to the human world around them. We've talked about a number of these thinkers already in this year, and we'll just kind of repeat a couple of them right now. Out of the Enlightenment, we're going to see some challenges to traditional institutions, all right? Namely, religion, and for much of Europe, it is the Roman Catholic Church by this point, and then the institution of the monarch. So starting with religion, guys. It was the church from the earliest days of the Middle Ages. It was the church that was establishing hierarchy, social and ultimately political hierarchy in Western Europe. Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge this. Because remember, the notion of the Enlightenment coming out of the scientific revolution is you have to be able to see something in action to justify its existence, right? You have to be able, like Newton has got to be able to drop that bowling ball or have that apple fall on his head to start to recognize the universal truths of gravitation, right? Well, same notion with religion. Religion has long been creating social hierarchies and political hierarchies. Remember the Pope putting a crown upon Charlemagne's head. We've already talked about the divine rights of kings, right? That religion has been used to justify the existence of the kings. But can anybody see that with their own eyes? No, you can't. You can't. You've got to. There's a faith. There's a belief that's involved. And so when we start to see kings in Western Europe who don't seem to be always fit to rule necessarily, or don't seem to be respecting the rights of their subjects, or maybe their subjects have very limited rights to begin with, this is going to be challenged. And it starts with maybe a guy named Voltaire, all right, a French guy, who's going to write in the 17th century, challenging the notions of the Roman Catholic Church's supremacy in France, and beginning to call for a separation between church and state institutions. And this is why in France, why is Voltaire writing this in France, calling for a separation of church and state? Why is this particularly challenging to the king?
Because the king was had the divine right of king.
Okay, yeah, because this is the notion. France is the epitome of the absolutist monarch, using divine right of kings ideology that says there's nothing between. There's no challenge to the king's authority outside of God himself, right? So Voltaire is going to challenge this. We're also going to see some political thinkers challenging the very political authorities that they live within. We've already mentioned John Locke this year. That every individual, John Locke says, has inalienable rights, and that word inalienable that is within our Declaration of Independence means they are rights that can't be taken away. All right? Inalienable, can't be taken away. And John Locke says that these rights are our lives and our liberty and our property, that they can't be taken away without just cause. And Locke also says that the power of a state should be derived from the consent of the governed. All right? So the people that are being ruled, the legitimacy of that government comes from those people's consent to be ruled in the manner that they see fit. And when people don't consent to the way they're being ruled, John Locke would argue there should be change, that is not natural. All right? Now, Locke is writing out of Britain, and Britain has, by the 18th century, 1700s, he's writing in the late 1600s, Britain has the most liberal monarchy in Europe. They're the ones that earliest on established a parliament, right? And we had, back in 1215, the Magna Carta starting to chip some authority away from a central king. So it's not surprising that a guy like John Locke would be writing out of England. What is surprising is that we have so much coming out of France. Here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Rousseau, and his social contract. Rousseau and the notion of the social contract, that the relationship between a state and a government and the citizens and the people is a social contract. I think of Confucianism and the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, that it's a two-way street, that the government answers to the people and the people answer to the government. This is the Rousseauian notion of a social contract. But this begins to chip away at the notion of a king or a monarch, like France would have had, and his subjects, right? A king and his subject, a king can do anything to his subjects. A ruler can't do anything to his citizens. Or a leader of a state can't do just anything to citizens. Citizens have rights as well. And that comes from the notion of a social contract. And one other Frenchman, and many of these enlightened thinkers are coming out of France, and France is the home to the most absolutist monarchy. This is the Baron de Montesquieu, And he argues for a limitation in the power of a government, and limiting the power of a government through the separation of that government's powers. This is why today the United States divides its powers between three branches of government. So there's not any one entity within government that becomes all powerful. Yes, ma'am.
What is that again?
Separation of powers. Limited government through separation of powers. Each of these men are challenging the traditional authority of the absolutist government supported by religion. So we spent a lot of time this year talking about legitimacy and what makes someone be seen as a legitimate ruler of a state. And so often it is coming through like just genetic lines, through a dynastic line, or it's coming through the support of a religious institution. These guys are all challenging this, that it should come from elsewhere. Some key documents of the Enlightenment that the College Board wants you guys to be familiar with. We all know this one. July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafts the Declaration of Independence of the United States. This is our founding document that is steeped in Enlightenment principles. You guys might remember from APUSH last year, maybe your government class last year, looking at the Declaration of Independence. But what does it say? Anybody remember any ideas within the Declaration of Independence? And how we can see that they're Enlightenment ideas? Yes? Very good. So we've got a little tweaking of Locke's life, liberty, and property, where Jefferson says that we all have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and he says pursuit of happiness. Right? Yes?
I think there was a lesson about how when the government starts treating you wrong, then you have the right to revolt.
Very good. That governments, where do governments come from according to Thomas Jefferson and according to these Enlightenment thinkers? Very good. Governments are derived from the men, from us. And they have their power from the consent of the governed. This is Locke, right? The government is only powerful when the people give their consent to it. And Jefferson goes on to say that if a government is ever not supporting or defending these inalienable rights, these rights that cannot be taken away, that it is, Jefferson calls it the sacred duty. Like, not just we can, but it's like we have to. It's our obligation to do what to that government? He's not quite that. He says we can alter it or abolish it. We can change the government if it's not doing what we need to do, or we can absolutely outright abolish it. This is Jefferson. But because Jefferson is a student of the Enlightenment, he recognizes that these changes, he says, cannot be made, for what Jefferson says in the Declaration, for light and transient causes. We can't just go abolishing our government for something trivial that's going to disappear tomorrow. And so, because he's a child of the Enlightenment, a student of the Enlightenment, he's got to explain to the world, he's going to tell the world everything that this king has been doing that challenges our political freedoms, right? Because in a rational, enlightened world, we have to see for our own eyes what's going on and how rights are not being respected. And this is the middle portion of the Declaration, right, that lays out the train of grievances. The king did this, the king did that, the king did this. And lo and behold, we declare our independence. So, big deal, Declaration of Independence. Got another one for you. Did I have a hand here? Yes, sir?
I was about to say, why does it say, because in the separation of church and state,
Yeah.
but then however in the our Declaration of Independence, it said we humans have basic rights given by God. Like, does it show a separation of church and state in that sense, or does it still?
The word God is not actually in there. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator. Now we say that, but that's really it. That's really it. It does not, and going further, the Declaration is not. A lot of young people, or a lot of people, confuse what the purpose of the Declaration of Independence and what the purpose of the Constitution is that ultimately comes. The Declaration of Independence is not a plan of government. It's a statement of principles that breaks us from the binds that we have with England. The Articles of Confederation originally, and then the Constitution that comes later, that's our actual plan of government. And within that plan of government, again, there is... The word God doesn't appear at all within it. We have a First Amendment that proclaims that the United States will not establish any state religion. but that the freedom to practice any religion that people might feel free to practice can't be infringed upon. Yes, sir?
So then why in the pledge does it mention?
Because we wanted to why the question is, why in the pledge do we have under God? Because we needed to convince the communists in the 1950s that we were God-fearing people on the right side of history. So we added under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Hello.
Hi, we're doing a newscast in speech, and one of the Mac computers are about to die. Do you mind if we borrow your charger?
Not at all.
Okay, thank you.
I hope it. There you go. There, you got an extra one in there. Boom. Okay, let's get it back. Let's get it back. So yeah, the Pledge of Allegiance, guys, is a very interesting story, and I would encourage you guys to read a little bit about it. It was not, like, our founding fathers never said the Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't written until the 1890s, and it was actually a man who was in cahoots with another guy who wanted to sell a lot of flags and had a great idea that he could sell American flags to schools and have every schoolroom across the country have an American flag if we could get people to say this Pledge of Allegiance to the United States every day. But that was without under God. And what is really more American than wanting to make a few bucks selling American flags? Yes? Yeah.
Didn't they used to do, like, the things where you, like, put your arm out, like, that Nazi do, but then we switched it to this?
Yep. Yeah, it didn't really look very good when we just stuck our hand out. But yes, the under God comes from the 1950s and the Red Scare era. Shh. Okay, Donna, did I have a hand back there? Okay. All right, yeah, that doesn't look good anymore. All right. We're going to talk about another document that you guys should be familiar with. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is from France. This is from the era of the French Revolution. Doesn't work? Not the right size? My bad. That's all I got. We're going to talk very briefly about the French Revolution because it's important to this story, guys. Arguably even more important than the American Revolution to the scope of world history. Because notice what the American Revolution does. It's colonists, it's big, it's colonists breaking from a mother country. That's big. But after the American Revolution, King George III still sits upon the throne in England. All right? They didn't get rid of the king. We just got rid of the king for one part of the empire. The French Revolution is going to abolish monarchy in France for a time. The French Revolution is going to be arguably more revolutionary than the American Revolution. All right? So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, you guys can take a look at it right here. From the Revolution. Can't read it, of course. This is actually drafted by a guy named the Marquis de Lafayette, who you probably remember from the story of the American Revolution. He was a Frenchman that was extremely important in helping our cause out. No, we don't. But we got our own fish to fry at that point. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is basically establishing the notion that French people are citizens of a nation rather than subjects of a king. And as citizens of the nation, they are equal with each other regardless of their social status. This is challenging. It's a direct front to the traditional aristocracy in Western Europe and France in particular. This will spur what is known to history as the French Revolution, where the French people will push for a dramatic departure from the traditional authority of an absolute monarch. They will demand a parliament where citizens of the state have the right to be represented in the actions of government. And ultimately, they oust the king. Now, there's a lot more to this story that would be for an AP European history class that we're not going to be getting into today. But they will ultimately oust the king. And not only oust the king, but put him on trial and ultimately execute the king. And that is the head of Louis XVI. Following the fall of the king, the French Revolutionary period arises and attempts to employ what are considered at the time enlightened ideas to rule a new nation-state of France. They adopt the metric system. that scientists had already been using. They adopt the metric system as a universal system of weights and measures. They abolish the calendar as it has traditionally been seen. Like the 7 day. You guys know why our week has 7 days? Because it's a religious thing. There's no reason the week necessarily has to have 7 days, but it's a Judeo-Christian religious tradition. On the seventh day, we rested. God rested, right? So the revolution in France, wanting to abolish the connection between church and state, because this is an enlightened idea, gets rid of the calendar. Creates a new calendar with 10 weekdays. All right? Yeah. 10-day weeks. My bad. 10-day weeks. 10 weekdays. That'd be a long day. 10-day weeks. Pardon me. They move to abolish slavery. They move to abolish slavery. And guys, we're going to talk about it in a couple days, but what is like in 1789, what is the greatest slave colony of France? In the Caribbean. Haiti. Very good. We're going to talk about Haiti later. They move to abolish slavery, although this is going to fizzle initially. They start using the guillotine to chop people's heads off. Because as twisted as it seems, that is enlightened. Because in pre-guillotine days, if you were going to execute someone, you would have like a hangman, or you would have an executioner with an axe, and that is a messy business. Sometimes there's a slip of the axe. Sometimes it doesn't cut clean through the head. So sometimes these things can be quite grisly. The guillotine is a device that makes scientific and enlightened the process of executing people. And one of the dark sides of the French Revolution is the idea, we have to remember, that it wasn't only Louis XVI's head and his wife's that were taken off of their bodies, but the guillotine was used on thousands of people that were seen to support the traditional monarchy. This is an event in the French Revolution known as the Reign of Terror. A couple years where thousands upon thousands of monarchists and former supporters of the king would find themselves falling in the revolution as well. Yes, ma'am?
So they went against the enlightened ideas?
No, it's crazy as it seems that this is actually seen as enlightened. Like, it wasn't enlightened for me to chop your head off with an axe, because that's grisly. But it is enlightened to have a precise machine do it that will work every single time.
Some people they went against the idea of the enlightenment.
Yes, if you were in opposition to the revolutionary movement, you were in trouble. All right?
Yeah, enemies of the revolution.
Absolutely. While this is happening, you can imagine that kings around France are going to be very nervous. Because if it becomes acceptable for the French people to rise up, snatch up their king, put him on trial, and lop off his head, every king in Europe is going to start feeling their own neck tightening a little bit. And so while this French Revolutionary era is pressing, we're going to see the invasion of France from neighboring monarchs. At one time trying to reestablish the monarchy in France, but also trying to chip away from French territory if they can gain something out of the chaos in France. So France, this revolutionary France, is going to have to put together a national army. Made up now not of subjects to a king, but as citizens of a nation. The first citizen army in modern Europe. One general that will rise out of these citizen armies will be a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. Shh, quiet, Alex. Napoleon Bonaparte, while holding on to some enlightened ideas like notions of separating the church and the state, will actually backtrack a little bit and essentially take away the voice of that parliament that would arise out of the revolution. And Napoleon would become, in his own way, an absolute ruler of France. But through this new French army and through the leadership of Napoleon, in the first decade of the 1800s, Napoleon's army in France would begin to create the French Empire. And they will conquer almost all of continental Europe. it's important to our story. They ultimately lose by 1815. They make a fateful invasion of Russia. They're going to be losing this war primarily to a British and Russian forces, and ultimately Napoleon is defeated. But what comes out of this is a spreading of French revolutionary ideas, because as these French armies are going to be marching from nation to nation, conquering lands, French revolutionary enlightened ideas are going to spread. Ideas of nationalism are going to spread. As Napoleon's armies are marching through Europe, flying the tricolor flag, which is like the first national flag of Europe, and singing La Marseillaise, which is the first national anthem of Europe. All right? As they're marching through, this is going to catch on in other areas. And we will see, following the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, the spread of nationalist sentiments in other nations, in other areas. All right? One other letter. Yes, ma'am.
So after they killed the king and like killed all the people who liked the monarchy,
Yeah.
what did they do? Like what kind of government did they set up?
No, there was a representative government that was set up initially, where there was some semblance of democratic vote from people that were landed, that had property ownership. There was some push to expand it beyond that, but very soon after the Reign of Terror, Napoleon is going to rise and essentially reassert a central authority.
Emperor as well, so that's kind of
Yeah,
the object.
there you go. There you go. One other note about the Napoleonic Wars. In 1815, you guys should be familiar with a meeting in Vienna, Austria, called the Congress of Vienna. Not to be confused with the Conference of Berlin or the Berlin Conference. That's in the 1880s that carved up Africa. This is the Congress of Vienna. Following the Napoleonic Wars, leaders of European nations got together in Vienna, Austria, to put Europe back together again. All right? And to reestablish a balance of power between European states, like Britain and France and Austria and Prussia and Russia. So this is called the Congress of Vienna in 1815.
They establish a balanced power. We establish balanced power in Europe. What does that mean?
Like, we don't want to have another France happen. We don't want to have another Napoleonic France happen. And this balance of power does a pretty good job in Europe until 1914, when World War I will break out, but that's another story for another day. One other document that you guys should be familiar of during this Enlightenment era comes from the Americas, and a man named Simón de Bolívar. We're going to talk about him in a second. Bolívar, B-O-L-I-V-A-R. It's where the nation of Bolivia today gets its name. Simón Bolívar was a revolutionary leader of the American Spanish colonies. He was a Creole military leader that argued for more rights, more political rights, and ultimately independence from Spain. And in 1815, he drafts a letter that's known as the Letter from Jamaica, that uses the same Enlightenment ideals that were driving Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, uses those same enlightened ideas to argue for the complete independence of the Spanish colonies of the Americas. So Simón Bolívar, his letter from Jamaica, arguing for independence of Spanish colonies in the Americas. It wasn't just political relationships that the Enlightenment was having an impact on. We would also, we're going to talk about this more on a later date, we would see a call for greater gender equality. We would see pushes for an end to the traditional feudal class systems, where those that own the most land have the most say in society. No. This is just going beyond the letters now. This is just additional drives within the Enlightenment era. So gender equality, more political equality for more people than just the traditional landed aristocracy. We will also see an end to the institution of slavery in the 19th century. And in Russia, the end of the the institution of the serf. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II of Russia, in a move to try to help modernize more rapidly the Russian state, he emancipates the Russian serfs. And with regard to the transatlantic slave trade, that will come to an end in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, and really starting with England as a driving force, but then followed by others. Slavery will be abolished throughout the 19th century in the Americas. England first, we see the end of slavery in Haiti very shortly after, in the early 1800s with the Haitian Revolution. We'll talk about that in a couple days. We will see by 1860s the United States ending our slavery institutions. The last holdout for slavery in the Americas was the colony and the state that brought in the most slaves,
Brazil.
and that is Brazil. They are going to hold on to slavery until 1888. I want to give you one last little bit on 531. A few new terms that we're going to associate with these people that desire some level of change from the traditional. So as the authority of the traditional monarchs in Europe will be challenged, we will see new political ideologies developing. I'm going to give you the words conservative, liberal, and radical, and these words still live with us to these days, right? Conservatives, liberals, and radicals. The conservatives of Western Europe during the 19th century. These were those individuals that wanted to maintain the traditional monarchs. While some might challenge the absolutist authority of those monarchs, they didn't want to get rid of the monarchies outright. They wanted to maintain their traditional monarchs. Now, why might somebody, what kind of person in Western Europe might find themselves being of a more conservative ideology? Yes. Yes, ma'am. Very good. The people who had good lives. The traditional aristocracy, right? The people whose power, and remember, do you guys recall what kings like Louis XIV started doing with the aristocracy? Yes, ma'am. Okay, he consolidated the aristocracy, he brought them to Versailles, and he started doling out, selling aristocratic titles, right? The original landed aristocracy, they became the aristocracy because they owned land for centuries, right? But as we had the growing of a wealthy middle class in Europe in the 1500s into the 1600s, kings said, whoa, we've got some people here that are going to start challenging this traditional setup. So we better start making them aristocrats as well. And the kings of Europe, like Louis XIV, started giving away titles and giving away land. Well, if you were given your title or if you were given some land from the king, you better keep that king in power. Because once that king is gone, your claim to your title, your claim to your land will be gone as well. So the conservatives tended to be those that benefited from the king. Maybe those landed aristocracy or the nouveau riche, the new aristocrats of Europe. Yes?
Or the relatives of the king?
Or
if they're like in line and they have the same last name.
Absolutely.
The dynasty or
people that are connected with the royal family, very good. Or if their jobs or titles come from that royal family. Absolutely. Those are the conservatives. Then there's the liberals. The liberals call for limits to state authority. Not necessarily going so far as to call for an end to the monarchy, although some liberals did. They pushed for more individual freedoms, that the kings should not be absolutists. They also pushed for representation in the government. This is what the French Revolution originally wanted. Before they lopped the king's head off, they just wanted a parliament where people would have a voice. And this is what liberals were demanding. And then there were the radicals. These were the far out there guys. The radicals said, we got to end the institution of the monarchy outright. And the radicals wanted to blow up the system, and they called for an expansion of voting rights and more social reforms. Interesting, though, if we look at like our history today, most Americans today would probably see themselves as being radicals. Like if liberals and conservatives in the United States today, if they believed the way they believed right now, if we were to transport them in a time machine to the 1790s in France, they would have been radicals. Because they wouldn't have accepted the traditional monarchic ruling class. They wouldn't have accepted notions, neither liberals nor conservatives, that the right to vote shouldn't be enjoyed by all citizens. All right?
Well, the liberals did that. You said they did advocate for individual freedom.
They did. They did. They did.
How come that's not the same as voting?
Well, they didn't necessarily want everybody to vote. That'd be rad. Like, hey, liberals want like people that own some property to be able to vote. Radicals want everybody to vote. Universal male suffrage. And the really radical, we're going to talk about women voting. That's crazy. We're going to talk about that at a later date, though. All right. One last thing to mention here, guys. There will be some kings who can see the writing on the wall, right? When you look at Louis XIV, when you look at Louis XVI having his head chopped off, other kings are going to say, wait a minute here. We don't want, yeah, a lot of them are related. We don't want that to happen to us. So we will start to see the rise in the 19th century of what are known as enlightened monarchs or absolute enlightenment. Where rulers like Catherine the Great of Russia, for example, she will be an absolute ruler, an absolute monarch, but she will start to allow some enlightened ideas enter the country. Ideas like prison reform and education reform. Russian, Catherine the Great. So these people are going to be known as enlightened despots. Like they're still absolute rulers, but they're going to allow some liberal reforms within their states. Now, do they really want to do this, or do they feel that they have to do this so they don't have what happened to Louis XVI happen to them? Probably a little of the latter. But it's going to be a reality. We're going to have some rulers who are going to offer some reforms so they themselves don't end up with their heads on the chopping block. Good?